We're very fortunate here today to have the leadership of campus be very supportive of these engagements between UCI and the continent of Africa. And our lunchtime speaker today is Dr. Thomas Parham, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. He's also an adjunct faculty member here at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Parham is a native son of Southern California and has degrees in social ecology and a PhD in counseling psychology. He's authored numerous books, 6 books, over 35 journal articles and book chapters, and he's also produced several videos on innovative approaches to counseling, including innovative approaches to counseling African descent people. He's appeared in public addresses and television appearances throughout the U.S. and has addressed issues such as multicultural counseling, counseling African Americans, cultural competence, educating youth, youth and violence, coping with stress, and many other things that all, I'm sure, make UCI a much healthier and better place, because universities are in need of all of these types of clinical competence. He's received numerous honors and awards, including, among others, a research award for contributions to the counseling profession from the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, awards from the American Psychological Association, awards from the Orange County chapter of the NAACP, selection to fellow status in the American Psychological Association Society for the Psychological Study of Ethnic Minority Issues, and election to the title of Distinguished Psychologist by the Association of Black Psychologists, which is the association's highest honor. Dr. Parham's role here as Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs puts him in the crosshairs of many fascinating, I'm sure, debates on campus and beyond in the community regarding cross-cultural dialogue and collaboration. And so we're very, very pleased to have him here today and talk to us about his initiatives and his support for ours. Thank you very much.
Get mic'd up here. Let me say good afternoon. Oh, let me try that again. I heard there were not only some African descent folk in the house, but people committed to trying to do this work. So let me try that again. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here as I get myself connected here. And I want to begin, first of all, by saying thank you to CECELIA, LYNCH, and Tanya. Where's Tanya at, by the way? Oh, there we are. Who have been persistent in both the invitation as well as the logistics and information to make sure that we could be a part of this. How exciting is this? I am out running around the country and the world, talking to folk about the values and virtues of a UCI education. And one of my favorite sayings is to say that the myth is different than the reality. Because people say, isn't Irvine that place like behind the orange curtain, like, you know? And I'm like, yes, we are behind that so-called orange curtain. But if you don't know that people do this kind of fascinating work here, that we have the first and only permanent African-American chancellor in the history of the University of California system. Y'all had a chance to meet Chancellor Drake this morning, yes? Those who are here and those who are here to see him again. It is a fascinating place. The myth is different than reality. And who would believe across the country today, if they said, pick for me the 5 places where you would have this collection of scholars, right? In Ngugi wa Thiong'o, internationally celebrated. Where would those places be? How many of the people you think would pick the University of California, Irvine? I remind you that the myth is different than the reality. So I thank Cecilia for that introduction that is way too long. Know that as a person of African descent, not just the Vice Chancellor here at Irvine, I understand the difference as a black man between what I do for a living and who I am as a person. My African roots teach me that. So what I do for a living is I'm the Vice Chancellor and a psychologist, and I do all that scholarly stuff and administrative stuff and clinical stuff and blah, blah, blah. But who I am as an individual, first and foremost, is a family man who strives to be a devoted husband to my wife and a nurturing father to my children and a supportive sibling to my brothers and sisters, a devoted son to my parents when they were living, and a strong man in my community trying to make the place better. So know that that is who you have invited into this place. I also want to say that as I add my voice to the chorus that will say welcome to those of you who are not from here, to the campus and to this forum, I am just so impressed with the excellence. And the speakers here that I've seen on the agenda represent a very impressive collection of intellects and passions that, when you appropriately synthesize, I've stylized a piece of African wisdom over time in my writing that says that life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. Let me say that again. Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. So when you have speakers with impressive intellects, and you can combine the intellect with the passion that, when appropriately synthesized, I think those things produce meaningful outcomes that will enhance, I think, our relationships and build a more impressive knowledge base. That is really what we are trying to do. So why is this work important? As Cecilia mentioned, I am a psychologist by training, committed to framing the discourse in my career in African American psychology. So my professional life and program of research has really been committed to and directed at issues of identity development and African-centered therapeutic practices and multicultural counseling. But there's some important lessons that I've learned in that I thought I would share with you this afternoon. Because somewhere I read that in all the theories that we study and all the constructs that we embrace and use and try to apply, there ought to be something wrong with a theory and a body of knowledge that leaves a people, in this case we're talking about African descent people, strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and inhuman to people who oppress them. There ought to be something wrong with that. So even as I look at the conversations, and I heard folk kind of framing and reframing the discourse and the narratives about people's experiences and what happens even on the continent. And I haven't been in the whole continent. I've been in just a couple of places on the African continent, one of the best experiences in my life. But it is, in some cases, a sad reality to not simply bear witness to the distorted perceptions that we in America have and around the world about what goes on the African continent, but to see how colonial powers have so contaminated the mindset of folk that the struggle for every day is not simply about economic or social or political or healthcare justice. It really is about trying to just reclaim their authentic African selves. That, to me, I think is what's important. There's something wrong with any theory that leaves a people strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and inhuman to their oppressors. Equally distressing is the production of a body of knowledge and information whose roots in a reservoir of scientific colonialism, that being that political control of knowledge and information, allow our brothers and sisters from other cultural groups to develop biases and assumptions about people and events related to Africa that are at best fashionably incorrect, and at worst, blatantly or almost pathologically distorted. Indeed, so much of the broad base of knowledge, whether educational, social science, life and natural science, economic, or even arts and humanities, is not anchored in the indigenous practices of what goes on the continent. It's fascinating to me. When I was president of the Association of Black Psychologists, And Wade Noble's the great scholar who was a year ahead of me in his tenure of the leadership of that association. We signed a covenant with the Ghanaian Association of Psychics and Healers so that we could do some exchange of information and kind of cross-training. So 6,000 miles away, we have a relationship with the healers, right? And the traditional healers in the bush and in, right, the villages. But we go to Africa and the people in the universities don't study from the traditional healers, they study Freud. Isn't that fascinating? Where the rite of passage for young girls when they get 14 is not to say, please elders, right, certify that I'm now prepared to step into my womanhood, or young men into manhood. But the rite of passage is I now am looking for some hair texturizer in order to straighten my hair, as a rite of passage for young African girls. There ought to be something wrong that leaves a people strangers to themselves and aliens to their culture. That is the unfortunate fact about so much of the knowledge and information that has emerged from academic institutions around the world for decades. And yet those of us who are deeply committed to this endeavor, through our actions, echo an assertion advanced by the Honorable Marcus Garvey himself. What Marcus Garvey reminds us is that chance never satisfies the hope of suffering people. It is only through hard work, persistence, and self-reliance by which the oppressed ever realize the light of their own freedom. So freedom in this case is the ability to redefine reality through worldview lens that is more crystallized and focused on things that are authentically African. And how delighted are we that we have decided to engage this conversation and embrace this initiative. Why is your work so valuable for UCIRVINE and really the students that we all represent and try to nurture and support? Our task in student affairs and the division that I manage is to support the academic mission of the institution. We exist to support the academic mission of UCIRVINE. But we also exist to create and manage co-curricular learning opportunities. We exist to help build bridges of understanding between individuals and groups of students. And so conferences like this and the dialogue and discourse, not just the people who are in the audience, but the electronic aids and the tapes that we make that will be shown, right, in the days and weeks and months ahead, really help our students learn in ways that might not be happening within the four walls of the classroom experiences that they, experience every day. So we now have a task of educating and training students to be global leaders. When I recruit students to come to the University of California at Irvine, I say you are coming not simply to be part of the Eater Nation, our mascot is anteaters, but you are coming to be part of a quest to be global leaders of tomorrow. And as I'm often fond of reminding them, as the great Asa Hilliard was before me, that you cannot relate to a global world with a local identity. Our students can't be global leaders of tomorrow with an identity that only sits in Orange County or in California or in the United States and doesn't travel outside, to different corners of the world to be able to learn that. Indeed, Africa is on the fast track. And there are lots of things I see in our homeland that distress me, but there are a lot of things that excite me, particularly as I look at growth rates now. If you look at a lot of the magazines, Forbes and others, they'll actually tell you that there are growth rates in different parts of Africa that broach what's happening even in Asia on their continent. International Monetary Fund identified 7 African countries on their list of the world's fastest growing economies, each with an annual growth rate of 8%. That's pretty staggering. That is phenomenal in what it says, particularly for folk who still are caught in a time warp about what's happening on the African continent. Democracy continues to take a stronger foothold, I think, in countries across the continent, with all but a few of nearly 1 billion people expected to vote in various countries' democratic elections. The West is now sinking and seeing that by 2030, it is expected that most African countries will have middle-class majorities, improvements in health, reductions in poverty, and investments in better infrastructure. All these things are happening on the continent that everybody is starting to pay attention to. What does it mean for us and our work and our students? We need to broaden our focus outside of Asia for growth and outside of the Middle East for conflict resolution. And to dialogue, right, that is happening here will help us be able to do that. Because there are lots of exciting things that are going on the continent that our students need to be able to learn. Our students need to be able to study. Our students need to be able to travel to. And your ability to really bring this together to forge that relationship is so important. The work of this group, the meaningful exchange of ideas and the commitments to collaborate and become partners in these collective academic and intellectual endeavors are necessary and required in order for the authentic exchange of ideas and learning to take place. And so as you look at the conference agenda, whether we're talking about protests and movements on the continent or collaborations between UCI and the University of Ghana, or critical investigations into humanitarian and African law, or honoring the work of Brother Ngugi wa Thiong'o, this forum is necessary and important step in continuing to produce the knowledge and information that will help us all become partners in managing the affairs of a global world. I close with a thought. And as I was thinking about what I might say to the group today, I had a kind of a flashback in my mind to when I was in Ghana back in 1999. And while I was there, I was very impressed by the monument and the statue of Kwame Nkrumah. And Nkrumah was an interesting leader, not just because of the success that they had in Ghana and the revolution and him being presented, right, as one of the first heads of African nation before the United Nations. And even ideologically, there's some things about, his stance that, sometimes I agree with, some I don't agree with, but he was a profound thinker in lots of ways. But he reminded us that in spite of the long and untiring work in education and organization of the pioneers of the civil rights movement in the United States, in spite of the painstaking efforts made by African American citizens of the United States to educate their children, and by hard work to achieve acceptance in American society, he wrote, African Americans have remained only barely tolerated aliens in the land of their birth, the vast mass of them outside consideration of basic human justice. Now, what's fascinating about those particular words to me is that snapshot that was taken decades ago, like most pictures that we take with a single lens, left more outside of the frame that it captured within it. Let me say that again. That snapshot, and any snapshot you take, always leaves more outside of the frame than it can possibly capture within it. And so, if one dares to embrace the broadest vision of human possibility and potential, then we're invited to see that human justice is not simply a commodity one seeks from people or forces of oppression, but rather human justice is an element of divine possibility that illuminates itself when each of us dares to see consubstantial nature of our common humanity. Consubstantiation, big fancy word that means elements of the universe are of the same substance. The consubstantial nature of our common humanity, and generate a knowledge base that can dissipate the ugly stains of ignorance and arrogance that have prevented us from collaborating as brothers and sisters, committed to the relentless pursuit of authentic knowledge and information that can free us literally, from the chains of conceptual incarceration that have prevented us from collaborating in ways that this forum has decided to do. That is why I'm so impressed with this forum. When I think about UCI Africa projects, when I think about forums like this, I can visualize the statue of Nkrumah in Ghana, reminding us that now that we are here in this unique space and time, in this collaborative space, that our mantra should always be, as he reminds us, forward ever and backward never. Lastly, I'm reminded as a psychologist by training, but as a healer by destiny. There's a Yoruba tradition that talks about this notion of ore ire, one whose consciousness is aligned with one's destiny. My destiny is to be a healer, even though I am a psychologist by training. And I'm reminded in that particular space that all of us, through our conversations, through our perspectives, through our language, both acquisition as well as communication, as well as our interventions, have the capacity to be a healing presence in the world. But we all relinquish our ability to be a healing presence in the lives of others, even in the production of knowledge and information. We relinquish that capacity and lose it. If we lose the capacity to believe that people, in this case we're talking about African descent people, but all of us as members of the human family, we relinquish that capacity if we lose the capacity to believe that people can elevate themselves to rightful places of rulership and mastery over their own circumstance. And part of what this conference does, part of what these scholars are committed to doing, is not only elevating and framing the discourse, but hopefully allowing us to come out of this particular circumstance here committed to the possibility and potential to not only raise the dialogue, to elevate the conversation, but to help build more bridges of understanding and collaboration that would allow us to do the important work that this world is so sorely in need of. With that, I'll stop and say thank you. It's nice to have you, and I congratulate you on the conference. Thank you.
I want to welcome everyone back to the first afternoon panel of our conference on charity and/or justice. The CEHA blog takes the great humanitarian debate to the next level. I'm CECELIA LYNCH, here once again at UCIRVINE, and I appreciate everyone's thanks, but you know, we don't have to go there anymore because it's really because of everybody's collaboration that makes this possible. And I think especially as people have thanked Tanya Schwartz, she's been absolutely amazing. As a graduate student, she probably regrets asking me to be her advisor. And also Sandy Cushman and Christy Salisbury, who we have just fantastic staff here at the School of Social Sciences and at UCIRVINE, and I can't begin to tell you all the ways in which they've gone above and beyond to make sure that everybody is fed and housed and that this works. And I also want to thank Tim Schwartz, our videographer. So I want to tell you a little bit about how the blog Critical Investigations into Humanitarianism and Africa got started, and then talk a little bit about what we think the next level might be and what we're trying to accomplish, although what we're trying to accomplish is still in the process of articulation. We had a conference, as I mentioned this morning, 4 years ago on this theme here at UCIRVINE, and a number of you were here, Silas KEMEDIO, Ken Kierstead, and a number of other people were part of that conference. It was a great conference. It was a wonderful time. And we decided that we really needed to move forward with different forms of collaboration and different ways of analyzing the critique of humanitarianism in Africa. This conference is a little bit different in that UCI's engagements with institutions and people on the continent have expanded. Tomorrow we'll hear from some of our students, former students and faculty, about artistic engagements with the University of Ghana, for example. There are a number of NGO engagements, and as well as the CEHA blog and just the very presence of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So all of those things we're very fortunate to bring together. One of the things, though, that going back to relationships and engagements with Africa, again, the ethos that motivates this conference is one of mutuality, to engage, learn, and produce joint research, policy, and artistic endeavors to learn from each other. And that's what the blog is really all about on the subject of humanitarianism. I was very fortunate to get a grant from the Luce Foundation that focuses on religion. My own work focuses on religion and humanitarianism and ethics, and has for some time in international relations. And the Luce Foundation grant enabled me to travel to South Africa, Ghana, and Senegal over this past summer, and to meet with many of the people on the panel, as well as many others, and to begin to engage in conversations about how we can actually collaborate on this thing that we might call the Great Aid Debate, and also how we can bring more centrally into the Great Aid Debate questions that have to do with what Ngugi was talking about, that spiritual dimension, the religious dimension. So the religious dimension both has to do with those legacies that people were talking about, those colonial legacies, for example. And it also has to do, though, with understandings of hope and spirituality that certain concepts have traditionally embodied for many religions, including Christianity and Islam. So the concept of charity, for example, or concepts of justice. To what degree has the concept of charity become appropriated by certain forms of noblesse oblige or paternalism? To what degree can charity also mean love, equality, mutuality? Why do we always think of how the West gives charity to Africa? At the conference 4 years ago, Ngugi started off by saying we should start to think about everything Africa has given to the world in terms of resources, in terms of labor, and also in terms of cultural forms and intellectual knowledge, and that's not sufficiently appreciated. How can we mess these things up? And how can our study of religion and religions help us do that? What about the layering that we started talking about earlier today? The layerings of what some call missionary religions, Christianity and Islam, as well as Hinduism and Buddhism on the continent, over other more, I'm not even sure how to call them anymore, traditional, local forms of religious practice. What do those local forms of healing and of other practices have to say to this broader aid debate and conceptions of charity? So these are the kinds of things that we want to accomplish in the blog, and that we want to dig deeper on in this panel. We really want to begin to flesh out some of the layers, contradictions, and possibilities that have to do with the organizational forms of religion and how charity might be organized, as well as the conceptual, spiritual elements of these terms, and how we can maybe peel back some of these layers and renegotiate or rethink relationships that result from them. So I feel very privileged because the Luce grant allowed me to do something that we have been wanting to do at the CEHA blog, which is to form relationships, collaborative relationships with institutions on the continent to really take this debate to the next level, take these issues to the next level. We can sit here and critique Western forms of humanitarianism all we want, but until we have more engagement with people living out, with people experiencing not only different forms of aid, but different forms of reactions to aid and different forms of understanding of charity and the richness and the deepness of those relationships, then we're seriously lacking. And so that's really what we want to do at the next level, if at all possible. Our panelists today, Dr. Simanga KUMALO, Dr. Silas KEMEDIO, Albert Bangawara, Tanya Schwartz, and Reverend Ranjit Matthews represent scholars, graduate students, and theologians, and an Episcopal priest. So we do have ordained people on the panel. One of the potential panelists who was not able to come, Abdulaziz Kebe from Dakar, from the University Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, unfortunately was not able to come, but he's a well-known scholar of Islam and is a commentator on Senegalese forms of Islam. So right now we're missing that dimension here, but I think that I know that we'll still have a very rich discussion. Another person that we're trying to bring into this discussion, and I think is willing, I know that she is willing to do that, is Dr. Akosua Adomako Mpofu, who is here from the University of Ghana, who is director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, and will be speaking tomorrow. And Akosua, the University of Ghana, we are engaging with on a number of levels, and this blog is something that is in different, or the collaborations are at different stages at different universities. So here we do want to engage with the diversity of meanings of charity in religious as well as secular thought, the relationship between that and what we conceive of as justice, what we conceive of as these relations among continents. Are these religiously articulated concepts of charity still useful? Should they give way to other religious or secular concepts such as human dignity, justice, or solidarity, or some combination thereof? Should charity be decontaminated, as one of the people I met with in South Africa last June suggested, to accord more closely with Christian or Muslim or traditional conceptions of mercy, love, and solidarity? Should we think of charity not from the oppressed, or rather not from the oppressed to or from those who are considered to be the oppressed, rather, to those who are normally considered to be the givers of charity? How might that, just as the Chancellor's map that he spoke of this morning, how might that reconfigure our understandings of charity? So we'll begin with Dr. Simangaliso KUMALO from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. His most recent book is on J.L. Dubé, the first president of the African National Congress. I have it here. And so we're advertising books today, so here is one. If anyone would like to take a look at it, so you can order it on Amazon, it's right here. But he's the author of numerous books. He's a senior lecturer and director of research and postgraduate studies at the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And he also directs the Ujamaa Center and is founder of the Religion and Governance Program at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's a theologian. He teaches courses in practical theology, public theology, and social history. And when I spoke to him about the blog this past summer, he immediately jumped on this and said, yes, let's do this. And so we are in the process of signing a memorandum of understanding, and we look forward to a lot more collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cecily, and thank you, colleagues in the panel, and thank you to those who have come to this meeting, and thank you to our father, Ngugi Wathiong. He might be outside, but his shade or Risitunzi is still with us. As long as he's still in these corridors and he has sat in this chair, we still feel his presence. Some people are so big that you can't miss them. Thank you very much. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to have been invited to come to this conference and to make a contribution. Now, just to appreciate the work that this university is doing, especially in collaborating with us from the African continent and reflecting on these issues. I was just sharing with my home girl there, Deborah Minri, that it's coming from Africa. I don't know how others feel about this at times. It's always interesting, whether I go to Europe, when I come to North America, or wherever I go, to find that there are more people working on Africa who are from outside Africa than those who are in Africa. It leaves you, there's a sense of celebration for that, because it means people are interested about Africa and to reflect about Africa and on it and all that. But at the same time, you also want to say, man, where are the Africans in Africa to come up and also make their voices to be heard? And so you always feel that way. And it is really an honor to be sitting with people who are doing this kind of work. So I'll briefly reflect on the topic that has been given to us. Now I just want to start with the quotation that was made by one of the religious leaders in South Africa during the time of apartheid. And he was reflecting on the work of the religious communities and how they were helping black people who were struggling against apartheid, and just to keep them going with resources of charity and food and clothes and all sorts of things. And in one of his addresses, Peter Story said, it is important to remember that charity is no substitute for objective justice. Charity is no substitute for objective justice. Now, when you are addressing a topic of this nature, where you are looking at development and humanitarian aid, one is actually dealing with issues of charity in some way versus issues of justice. And that, for me, frames what I'm about to share with you. In this talk, I will just briefly look at try to define humanitarian aid and development aid. And then after that, I will discuss the dynamics that inform our understanding of these issues in the religion and governance, meaning here there's two of us, Albert and I, who also works for us in the religion and governance program, and we've reflected on these issues together. And then I will try to propose what I think are sinews of a way forward on how we can respond to charity or humanitarianism and development aid, especially from a religious perspective. Humanitarian aid is really intended to support humanitarian situations that arise, such as poverty, catastrophe, and even disease. And most of the time, we find that religious organizations, or what we call faith-based organizations, and also NGOs, get involved in trying to help communities to respond to these challenges. Now, this is very important in the African context. It is sometimes difficult for some of us to admit, but reality is there is a huge majority of people in the African continent whose survival from one day to another depends on the availability of charitable resources, simply because their governments are failing to respond to people's needs. You can start from Cape to Cairo and then going through what's going on in our continent. A lot of ordinary people depend on aid that comes from outside the continent just to keep going from one day to another. And that's simply the failure of good governance. There may be other factors, but it's also, and I think it's time that we, from the African continent, start looking at ourselves with honesty and some of the things that we should have done, which we have not done. Okay, there are countries that have been free of colonialism and all that for over 40 to 30 years. But within those countries, it's like when it comes to economic issues, it's like they have never been free. Some sections of our society are enjoying the benefits of being a free nation, and some pockets still remain behind. And it is through the work of charity organizations that women and children and some men have been helped to continue living their lives. And without that work, you might find that they would have collapsed. I know of countries in our context that actually the education, if you go to countries like Swaziland and countries like Lesotho, countries like Tanzania, the education system and even the health system is standing strong simply because it's still sustained by the churches. If the churches would withdraw their support to the education system and the health system, the whole thing would collapse. That is still a reality. 20, 30 years later, you still find that. And so those are challenging situations that our people find themselves. So the humanitarian aid becomes quite vital and important in that situation. So no matter how we politicize it and we critique it, it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, where the rubber hits the road, some people need this to survive. Secondly, there is then development aid, which is normally the one that is offered to countries through formal institutions. It's divided into two categories. There is the bilateral aid, where one country agrees with another country that they will give them money to sponsor some infrastructural programs that they are building, maybe roads, they are building schools and all that, and they will have to pay that back to those countries. That's aid again. And then most of the African countries are benefiting from this through some partnering with some other European or North American countries through this kind of support. This is very good, but it also has its own challenges. As you know, that always the hand that feeds you sometimes is the one that begins to tell you what to do. And for your own survival, you depend on respecting that hand. So there are those challenges, important as this may be. And sometimes then those governments exert some control to the political leaders. And the political leaders themselves feel that they are indebted to the leaders of those governments that sponsor and support their work. And then leaders end up not being accountable to their own people and their own constituencies. They end up treating people with disdain, in fact, or even indifference, because they know they give. And in fact, when they give the resources to the people, it's like it helps to increase the village chief mentality, patronage, because then it's like, I have gone all out to get this support for you, and somehow you owe me. You owe me something as the people. And so the people lose the power to control or even to give direction and to keep their leaders accountable. And the leaders are kept accountable by those who support their work. Now the other one is the multilateral aid, which would normally come through institutions like the Britain's institutions, IMF, UNAIDS, World Bank, and others, that is given to the continent to support the work. And again, there are terms that are dictated to people towards that, on what they need to do. And in many ways, that support goes there, but it doesn't come free. And it gets those countries into debt, serious debt, so that before They can even think about budgeting for their people, for health and all sorts of other things. A huge chunk of the national budget must be used to repay these debts. And most African countries are indebted. Very few are free of this debt, and it's difficult to remain free of this. It's attractive and it's available. And the interesting point is that all these countries that give this kind of help and support to Africa, and even those people who give humanitarian support to Africa, they do not see the connection between what Africa offers to them and what they offer to Africa. So when people go to Africa to work as missionaries or whatsoever to support, we've got missionaries and all sorts of people, NGOs workers, FBO workers, flooding Africa. In fact, Paul Gifford, who has done some work he's a sociology of religion professor, has said that in a month, if you calculate the planes that go to Africa, 6 of them are carrying workers, humanitarian workers, especially for religious organizations of one kind or another. Every month, 6 loads of flights that goes to Africa are for people who are going to do work based on missionary work or even whatever humanitarian work that is available there. And so you go to Europe, you hear people saying, oh, I've been to Tanzania, I worked there for 3 years. Oh, I was working in Sudan. Oh, I was working everywhere. In some way, we are offering opportunities for citizens of the world who are wanting spaces where they can put their lives into something that seems much more meaningful than just chasing success and privilege that is out there. For people who want to do something of value with their lives, they go to Africa. But that is not seen. Africa is seen as having to be grateful for having had these people. No one looks back and say, oh, how wonderful it is. You welcome us to actually satisfy our own vision and longing to be of service and to be of use in making the world a better place for everybody. That is not even thought about. What is thought about is that we must forever be grateful that people are flocking into the continent. That's the one point. And so when the aid comes, nobody says, actually, we are compensating what Africa is giving to us. No. The next point is we talk about development. If you look at the amount of resources that Africa has, South Africa alone has got the 88% platinum that is given to the world. 88% of it. There's no country in the world that has got more platinum than South Africa. You talk about gold, you talk about diamond, that is scattered all over the continent. That is one or another. And oil. In fact, my sister from Nigeria, from Ghana, I said to her, we heard that you've discovered oil in Ghana. And she said, don't you know that we've discovered a curse? It's no longer something to treasure and celebrate. It becomes a curse because suddenly you are going to attract all sorts of people from outside the continent who come into the continent to get that in many different ways. Now, 2 years ago, the oil that came from Nigeria to America was almost 10% of all the oil that came, and even more. But the question is, when any bit of help that comes from the other parts of the world that goes to South Africa or to Africa as a whole, it's not seen as something that we're in a partnership here. You are helping us and now we are helping you because of the, no. When it goes to Africa, Africa must always be so grateful. but the rest of the world is never grateful on what is coming from Africa. It's not recognized. So how do we see this? So instead of seeing it really as some kind of development aid, aid is not a good term that I appreciate. I don't appreciate aid because it means you are so helpless. You can't help yourself. You need to be aided to become. Maybe we need to be looking at a term that brings to us an awareness that this is partnership. So maybe we call it development partnership between Africa and the rest of the world. So that we balance the scales that we see in this situation. I'm about to finish now. Just want to raise this one other point. And as far as religion is concerned, there is a realization now that religion in Africa is an important asset that the African people have. At times it's seen as a liability by people who have issues with religion, maybe from the other parts of the world. And so when they want to engage into development work and all that, I would say, no, don't tell us about religion and all that. We're just wanting to concentrate on development and all that. But the religion, in fact, is a point of departure for Africans. Whether it comes to issues to social, economic, and political issues and all that, they start from a point of religion. Be it African traditional religion, be it Christianity or whatsoever. So it is important that when we are going to participate in initiatives that brings about growth and progress, we start with where people are, with what they already have as an asset. It is through religion that people begin to have their own, to think, to build their language, to understand their worldview is built on religion. And even then their assets, schools and all the hospitals and all that, operate from a point where they see religion as a positive asset that they use to do that. The last point that I want to raise is it becomes unfortunate then when aid is then used as a way of controlling how people must think and run their own homes or even their own countries. A good example of this, there is still this huge issue in Africa about gays and lesbians and homosexuals. Those issues still a very difficult issue in Africa. But now there has been an attempt by leadership in part of the world to say to some African countries, unless you relax your laws on this issue and change it, we are not giving you this aid. Uganda has had to face that directly, and others have had to face that. I'm not saying they're right by being anti-gay and anti-homosexual and all that, but I think it's because there's lack of partnership and trust that we begin to treat each other that way. If we trusted one another, would actually, if there is support, we'll just give the support because it's the right thing to do. Would not have to say, unless you see things the way I see them, you are not getting my support. I think we call for a development partnership than all the other things like aid and whatsoever. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. CILAS KEMEDIO, who was on the previous panel. CILAS is Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Rochester. He's originally from Cameroon. At Rochester, he's director of the Frederick Douglass Institute for African American Studies. He spoke a lot about his work on Mongobeti, but he's also published extensively on negritude and la créolité. And he also has been a partner in crime from the get-go on the CIHA blog. and was here at our previous conference and has been working on the humanitarian misunderstanding, as he calls it, for some time. So, Silas.
I want to thank Cecilia and Dr. KUMALO, and I kind of feel a big challenge speaking after Dr. KUMALO, because he was telling me that he's a scholar of religion, but he's also, I think, an ordained minister. So he's a professional speaker, and I'm going to need all the help of his prayers to not look too ridiculous. So I'm going to reflect on the issue of charity within humanitarianism and social justice. And I'm going to look at some of the points when the religious and the secular meet. I'm going to start with a challenge raised by Kwame Anthony Appiah in his book on the cosmopolitan ethics in a world of strangers. And he suggests that the implementation of human solidarity requires us to go beyond particular and localized commitment and root for a truly cosmopolitan ethics. And I quote Appiah: "Each person you know and can affect is someone to whom you have responsibilities. To say this is just to affirm the very idea of morality. The challenge then is to take the minds and hearts formed over the long millennia of living in local troops and equip them with ideas of institutions that will allow us to live together as the tribe we have become." End of quote. Humanitarianism has emerged as one of the modalities of implementing this ethical demand. Some scholars have argued that the movement to abolish the slave trade could be seen as the prefiguration of modern humanitarianism. The movement marks the passage from charity to a more cosmopolitan form of action. Yet, abolitionists do not necessarily challenge the hierarchical dimension of philanthropy. We all too well remember the image of a black man kneeling and asking, "Am I not a brother?" That was used during the campaign to abolish the slave trade. This image, I think, is the most powerful inscription of the unequal distribution of power that is reproduced in the workings of non-governmental organizations intervening in less fortunate parts of the world, especially in Africa. These NGOs are, and I quote, "top-down efforts in which money and expertise empower some to act for or in others," end of quote. NGOs are a place where charitable intentions meet the philanthropic arm of capitalist donors to make humanitarian practices possible. NGOs and capitalism do proceed from two radically divergent motivations. And that's why I think we should suspect their alliance. As Margaret Atwood reminds us in her book, Payback, Death and the Shadow Side of Wealth, when you read the story of Scrooge, and I'm quoting her, Scrooge's happy ending is entirely in keeping with the cherished core of capitalism. His life pattern is worthy of Andrew Carnegie. That is, make a bundle by squeezing and grinding, and then go into philanthropy. Ngugi in The Wizard of Crow makes the same argument when you suggest that missionaries were charged with managing the welfare department of colonialism. In today's global capitalism, NGOs have replaced missionaries as the most visible, and I'm not saying the only, as the most visible managers of the compassionate arm of what some have termed quote-unquote cutthroat capitalism. We may ask if the move from the mostly religious to mostly secular have fundamentally altered the business of humanitarianism. So that's a question we may consider. But NGOs do combine the traditional notions of charity with the ethical universalism that Appiah is calling in the quote I used to start my remarks. I believe that some of the non-state agents intervening in the humanitarian field do their best to meet this challenge. That is, to equip themselves with ideas and practices that allow them to be better citizens and neighbors in the tribe we have become. The role of a platform such as the critical investigation into humanitarian interventions in Africa is precisely to take up Appiah's challenge and see whether or not agents of the global humanitarian galaxy have met it. Barnett and Weiss suggest that, and I'm quoting, discourses surrounding rights, sovereignty, and justice have slowly but impressively created new standards for states, provided new metrics of civilization, and suggested a new rhetoric of justification for intervention on behalf of the weak and powerless, end of quote. The question we must therefore confront will be whether or not the full humanity of the quote-unquote the weak and powerless is taken into account in the course of humanitarian interventions. These are rather uneasy questions because humanitarianism is quite allergic to critical analysis, as David Kennedy noted in his book, The Dark Side of Humanitarianism. Any attempt to even consider asking such questions may unleash what Barnett and Weiss call, quote-unquote, an ontological insecurity in the humanitarian galaxy. To ask a question is sometimes misunderstood or equated with automatic suspicion, if not outright condemnation of the good deeds of selfless Good Samaritans whose only mission is to redeem the compromised humanity of the weak and the powerless. And I use here the term Good Samaritan on purpose because the critical discourse on humanitarian practices becomes almost impossible to emerge when they are framed as a moral duty originating in religious obligations, or at least articulated in the language of religious metaphors. And we just heard from Dr. KUMALO how some people depend on aid from their survivor. This argument makes it almost impossible for critically looking at the dark side of aid. Because if someone starts criticizing humanitarian aid, and that critique somehow disrupt or interrupt the flow of aid, who can stomach dead bodies killed by his or her analysis? Not me. So on the subject, so one of the subjects, for example, analyzed in the blog was precisely the so-called act of Zoé affair. And I'm reminded of this case because there's currently a trial in France surrounding the case. The Zoé act was an NGO specializing in rescuing orphans in Africa and placing them in loving families in Europe. As it turned out, some of the orphans were not exactly orphans during a mission in Chad. The organizers of the mission, the Good Samaritans, were then arrested and charged with child abduction in Chad. Nicolas Sarkozy, then French president, took his plane, went personally in Chad to take back the Spanish crew because the charity has a plane and a crew. A summary trial proceeded, sentences were passed down, and in what amounted to a parody of justice, the condemned French were immediately released in the custody of the French government. The critical exploration of this episode exposes the misunderstandings that surround humanitarian practices. To go back to the challenge raised by Appiah, it clearly showed that the Zoé Act, the French government, and even the French public were not equipped with ideas and institutions that allow them to live together as the global tribe we have become. Their actions were more likely consistent with a bygone colonial era that granted them unprecedented power to invoke the right to civilize and to inflict untold acts of violence and humiliation on the people deemed inferior. But this episode, the Good Samaritans were out officially to redeem the presumed orphans from a former French colony. So the Good Samaritans, unfortunately, were caught. These orphans also, and to make the case more compelling, these orphans were caught in the Darfur tragedy. So it even made the rescue mission even more compelling. The NGO has since disbanded. It did not even have, as the name may have suggested, a religious affiliation. Yet the name does tell us that charity associations are sometimes located at the intersection of the religious and the secular. Because simply having a name that referred to the Bible, I think made them more appealing. So it was a marketing strategy. They have no religious affiliation. And the latest I heard is that the people who were running the charity, I think now they are businessman and woman in South Africa, something like that. So they left the business of charity altogether. But we can detect in the conflation of the religious and secular in the figure of Albert Schweitzer, for example. He was both a doctor, a medical doctor, and a preacher. He was both redeeming the body and the spirit. So the humanitarian was a preacher, and he was the embodiment of the good colonizer. He was the white, and this is a quote, the white like no other white who loved the natives. His actions, therefore, spoke for themselves, meaning they were beyond criticism. Any attempt to simply put him through the challenge formulated by Appiah was construed as a gratuitous act of character assassination. The post-colonial intellectual ought to go beyond this mystification to unmask what is covered by the redemption enacted by Good Samaritans, from missionaries of colonial times to agents of the global humanitarian order. The post-colonial critic ought to extricate herself or himself from the trapping of humanitarian-induced amnesia. Indeed, according to Margaret Atwood, and I'm quoting, "Without memory, there are no debts. A debt is something owing for a transaction that's taken place in the past. And if neither debtor nor creditor can remember it, the debt is effectively extinguished. Forgive and forget, we say. And in fact, we may not be able to forgive totally unless we forget." End of quote. And here I go back to what Dr. KUMALO has eloquently articulated, how the memory of what goes from the West to Africa is loudly kept and broadcast. In the meantime, he has pointed out the memory of what goes from Africa to the rest of the world is systematically obscured. The recovery of the mutilated memory can help in the critical investigation of the redemption that the colonialists and their descendants claim to have made possible. The debate over charity within humanitarianism, at least that's what I believe, is also and foremost a debate over the term of the very act of redeeming. Redemption, as we all know, is at the center of the Christian faith and cannot be separated, according to Atwood, from death. And I quote her again. The Christ is called a redeemer, a term drawn directly from the language of death and of death, and thus also from that substitute of sacrifice. In fact, the whole theology of Christianity rests on the notion of spiritual death and what must be done to repay them, and how you may get out of paying by having someone pay instead. Therefore, the debate of charity in humanitarianism intervention is also about its cost. What is the cost of being redeemed? Asking about the cost of redemption invites us at least to consider the theoretical possibility that these selfless acts may not be what they appear to be. Dr. Schweitzer is seen in one scene of the film that basically is a challenge to his mythic character. He is seen beating native Africans into walking his field. He justified this violence by the fact that Africans are being helped by Good Samaritans. In return, he continues, they must work for him. Forced labor, it could be said, is the cost of redemption in this specific instance. According to Atwood, the resentment at unfair treatment being a universal unpaid debt that cries out for a balancing of the scales, the African forced to work for Schweitzer may seek reparation, may seek the balancing of the scales. Charity is repaid in kind in what amounts to be a debt of gratitude, and that's what Dr. KUMALO has also said. It is not up to the bloc and its contributor to pass moral judgments. It is not up to the bloc to seek the balancing of scales. It is critical that the voices of native Africans that were at the other end of Schweitzer action be heard and critically investigated. If we do not pay attention to the voices of these Africans victimized by colonial humanitarians, we may not remember their side of the story, for again, without memory, there are no dead. So it is therefore our responsibility as scholars to raise these questions. Thank you very much.
The tricks of technology. Thank you very much, Silas. Our next speaker is Albert Bangarana, who is a doctoral student in the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Albert's research interests focus on HIV/AIDS, gender, religion, and governance. He's part of the program on religion, governance in Africa, in the world, and the gender and religion program at University of KwaZulu-Natal. He has degrees in theology, as well as philosophy and social sciences. And he's participated in a number of international conferences in South Africa and Senegal. A lot of his current work is focusing on surveillance and power and religion and sexuality in the context of HIV and AIDS, and he has a number of publications forthcoming, including with Codestria in Senegal, one of the foremost institutes of social science research on the continent. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Cecilia, and I feel privileged to be here and to contribute in a small way, but also in a bigger way, to disseminate some, research that I have been doing, that I also have done, but with regard to Africa and foreign aid or development assistance, and trying to engage with the discourse or expanding this particular debate. As they were saying that offering critical approaches to aid in some ways, creating dead bodies, they're kind of scaring me. But I said, well, I will still engage with the debate critically because I place myself more as a critical scholar. And I aim at least creating a star rather than creating comfort zones in scholarship. Yeah. So basically, I'm placing my research within the African experience framework, and I will also look at surveillance theory as I place myself as using African experience or my own experience within the African context to offer critique to the surveillance within the aid discourse. First and foremost, surveillance studies basically relates to power and control, and I argue that surveillance in this particular discourse of aid aims at aggregating groups or even countries into constructions that perpetuate vulnerability and systematic dependence. And specifically, surveillance creates chains of intermediaries. And these chains of intermediaries can be in terms of information, money, and other resources that can be used actually to entrench direct and indirect power and control systematically to these groups under surveillance. So with this in mind, I would like to deliberate on various factors. And I would like to begin first and foremost with a few facts. I table facts and then I engage and I go to critical arguments. The fact is that 1 billion people are going hungry every day globally. And around 300 million of these are actually in sub-Saharan Africa, where 1/3 of arable land is untilled. What does this mean? Where we have vast land, arable land untilled, and at the same time, we have over 300 million people going hungry. What pictures do we see that come from the continent of Africa, most of the times in the media? Hands exposed, kind of maybe begging hands, waiting to receive from the other. But does this mean that there is no resource that could support these particular people? I beg to say no. I state my argument. First and foremost, Africa has the ability to feed itself. And at the same time, it could be a global food supplier. Looking at the arable land in the West and in the North, comparatively, Africa may have much bigger arable land compared to that. Is it fully utilized? That is another question. Should Africa be dependent on others in terms of food supply? I guess not. But is that the reality? Well, yes. Why should we have this particular circumstance within the continent? I present a few critical arguments. I would say there are bottlenecks. And when I say bottlenecks, I mean structural bottlenecks within the African government structures. These are basically resulting from, I would argue, from aid dependency syndrome, the ADS. Why would I argue on that account? First and foremost, I may pin it to the point that this could be a result of the reluctance of most of the African governments to enact and implement sustainable growth-oriented policy reforms. Well, it's basically psychological that if a person is dependent, well aware of the Freudian discourse of the child, it's highly pertinent that this particular person may not be able to think wide enough through the challenges of the time to be able to sustain oneself. But if I am allowed to face the challenges, then supposedly so, I will be able to find ways within which to survive. Before, there were arguments that, well, our brothers, African brothers and sisters here, they managed to develop semantic discourses within their own context to survive and communicate. How does that come about? Being allowed to exercise oneself within the context, facing the challenges, can actually assist the growth of the mind and of capacity. As they say, if you are not challenged, then you may not be able to develop necessary mechanisms to survive. What would be the dilemma? The dilemma is the good intention of aid and hence its effectiveness Can we say that aid is bad? Personally, I wouldn't say, well, it is really bad. But I will still critique it with regard to its effectiveness. Why the effectiveness? I rationalize that aid associations and the African nightmare is my basis. What results from this? First and foremost, when you look at the African continent and you look at our currency and the greenback, we find out that first and foremost, there is no African currency that equals any of the Western or Northern currencies. Why is it so? Is this intended, or is it, as I may argue, a fiscal policy? If you ask economists, it is a fiscal policy. And fiscal policies have repercussions. When the World Bank or the IMF asks a certain country A to devalue its currency as a fiscal reform, there are repercussions, as economists may argue. In other words, it inconveniences the balance of payments. And when you are selling your resources, even in their raw form, you are actually gaining much less. You are donating, as I may argue. You are literally receiving peanuts. The other problem is untenable debt. I won't elaborate much more on that because it has already been said. Civil unrest. It's highly, absurd that in the 1990s, Africa had more unrest than the rest of the world put together. Why, you would ask me why exactly this particular era in time. The 1990s and a little bit before, and actually 1990s and beyond, that's when we had the structured adjustment policies within most of the African economies. And these included the devaluation of the currencies, forced retrenchments, and so on. Why? Because African nations were highly indebted. And in order to get the money to pay up for this, they were told they had to cut spending. And cutting spending was not cutting spending on the breakfast of the president or the minister. It was cutting spending on healthcare, education, industry, infrastructure development, I mentioned it. And what left of the population? Destitute. And what is the result of an angry person? Hungry person is an angry person. And the repercussions, civil unrests. And civil unrest, they benefit who? Who manufactures the guns? So when there are civil unrests, guns are sold. There are a few African countries that manufacture guns, by the way. So the bullets, guns, ammunition, they are sold to these particular people. And how are they sold? They may not necessarily have money, but they have resources. So it becomes a barter trade. We go back to the prehistoric, way of doing business. So you barter your gold for guns. You see, I give an example of the DRC. Diamonds, coltan, these are highly expensive mineral resources that go into barter trade for guns. Then we have political factionalism internally, of which there are different political parties. Then the government, in other words, uses the money, aid money, to fund its own projects and to thwart the other political parties to sustain itself into power. So there is a lot of disgruntledness among the people, and that leads to instabilities, internal instabilities. And access to free And access to free aid dollars at the end of the day leads to corruption. How does this affect investment? First and foremost, we have lack of poor physical infrastructure like roads and machinery, lack of legally enforceable property rights and land titles, an attractable investment environment, basically because of unrest and so on. And this has affected, first of all, the African countries' credit ratings. And as we understand, credit ratings are important to access better sources of capital. For example, in the other economic, more developed countries. Statistically, only 19 of African countries out of the 53, now 54 with Southern Sudan, are with international credit ratings, according to the 2010 Bloomberg data. So does that give us the opportunity even to borrow money equivocally? No. So you have to trade yourself. You see. And then we have corruption, as I have reiterated. Corruption is one of the major problems of the African continent, of which 40 of 42 African countries surveyed scored under 5 on a scale of where 0 indicates the highest country in corruption. You can see how it is. So in other words, aid, instead of creating what it is intended for, it ends up creating the reverse. Why? I will argue that later. So aid and government responsibility to citizenry. This is democracy under threat. With culture of aid, African governments, as argued, they end up abdicating their responsibilities. Citizens cannot actually hold responsible their own governments. Why? Because who cares? They don't have the resources, and at the end of the day, the government feels doesn't depend on them. So in other words, they lose their franchise. And then it creates dependency and fosters more the donor interests. Aid as a moral imperative. Humanitarian aid, in other words, is good in a way that it helps us, there has been argued, to put food maybe on some people's table and so on. But if we say so, I still argue that we must face the reality. Sometimes we must face the reality. What would happen if at a certain time Africa had no aid? Would people start thinking of more long-term sustainable development policies that will be able to utilize the available resources to sustain the particular economies? Personally, I believe so. So, the more aid that we get, the more, I believe, complacent and lazy people become. The capacities are there, but they must be developed. And the aid that comes in should be able to facilitate those capacities, not undermine the existing capacities. And for me, as a person, I believe aid comes in a way it undermines those particular capacities. Last, I still believe that where aid has been used profitably, it has actually, we have like corporate social investment. I consider that as locally developed aid from our own industries and factories and other corporations in our various countries has actually helped a lot. And this corporate social investment could be diverted to the development of various infrastructure within the various countries, thereby limiting more and more development aid that has ties on it that are detrimental to the particular economies. The other good thing coming out of Africa is the growth in democracy. At least 48 countries, now around 50% of African countries are holding regular elections, which is very good. Why? Because in some way, aid has contributed to that. That is positively. And the other thing is, with a favorable economic environment, if aid is harnessed well, we would be able to spiral entrepreneurship and hence job creation. And within this whole discourse, I incorporate the aid that is related or diverted through the religious organizations. Because for me, I believe aid through religious organizations and aid outside religious organizations through NGOs, that is CBOs, faith-based FBOs and CBOs, and NGOs, it almost has similar strings, because most of this aid comes as well from governments, although the effects are different. So what we need to see is whether the aid that is diverted through CBOs, FBOs, and NGOs is doing much better than the aid diverted through development organizations, of which there are repercussions of payment, debt servicing, that at the end of the day keeps economies tied to vulnerability and perpetual dependence. So I personally present this and leave you with more questions. I'm not going to present responses. I'm not going to present any way forward. But what I'm going to tell you is to think about these particular points and in our own capacities, try to devise means and ways of responding to this particular phenomenon. Thank you. That I had
Yes, we're not intentionally trying to trip people up, but yes, I do it all the time. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Tanya Schwartz, who I think everybody knows very, very well, but they don't know about her work, her own work, which is on the role of prayer, actually, in peace building and reconciliation. That will be Tanya's dissertation work. She's a doctoral student here in political science at the University of California, Irvine, and she is the editorial assistant and major backbone of the CEHA blog. Tanya.
Okay. So apologies, I didn't prepare some sort of formal talk about my research or something like that. What I want to talk about is the blog and talk about how I see the steps that need to be taken to move forward and how sort of my perspective of the blog informs what we're doing. And I'll go about that by sort of bringing us to something that was recently in the news. I don't know how many of you saw, there was a picture, a photo that was being circulated throughout the media, at least in the US, throughout Facebook, social media sites, of a policeman, and I believe it was in New York City, who had bought a homeless man a pair of boots. I think that many people saw this. And it kind of, it went all around Facebook and Twitter and everything, and the reaction by many people was, isn't this a wonderful thing? We've had all of these, after the Occupy movement, we had all of these, critiques of the police force, and to see, this police officer buying boots for this homeless man, isn't this a great thing? Isn't this a nice, change? Well, then a couple days later, one of the journalists for The Guardian wrote a critique. And there were a few things that he kind of pointed out. One of the things was that a couple days after those boots were bought for this man, a journalist went and found him and saw him without the boots again. And he asked him, what happened? Why are you not wearing the boots? And the man said, well, I'm really worried that somebody else could harm me to try to get these boots. They're such nice boots. I'm not gonna, just wear them out for everybody to see. So there was that. Besides that, journalists started looking into this man's history, his background. And he started to be villainized, actually. People started saying things like, he chooses to be homeless. It's not that, things have happened to him. It's that he is chose this way. He's lazy. So there is that. And then the other thing that that this journalist said from The Guardian that I think really goes along with what we do at the blog, or what I see as what we do at the blog, is he said, what is this picture actually showing? If you just look at this picture, what is it showing? And he said, what it shows to many people, the narrative that kind of comes along with this picture, is that this is the way to fix the world. This is the way to help people. Let's give stuff, and let's not address the broader social issues that are going on. And I think that that's right. That's how I view it, at least. So I, shared this critique with friends and family, and there were a lot of attacks that came back at me that said, "Oh, what are you doing? You're, criticizing a policeman. We can't have a good, cop out there and whatever." And I said, well, no. Did you read the article? It's not that I or this person is necessarily critiquing the policeman. We can say that that is, a nice thing that he is trying to do. However, there are all of these other things that are going on the outside that picture just leaves out, that we need to talk about. And I think that as a college student, as a graduate student, many of our students, we see as TAs, many of our students are really interested in going into humanitarian aid work. Many, many, many of them. And Aisha Nibi is going to speak tomorrow about invisible children and the Coney 2012 phenomenon. And that was huge. That video, it had 100 million hits. That really drew people in. And I think that Dr. KUMALO is right when he says young people, not just young people, but people from the West, in many cases from the global North, really want to do something, really want to go and help people. But it's really kind of more about themselves and kind of, making them feel better. Now, I think that there are, I think it is a persuasive argument when people say, oh, well, so are you just saying cut all aid? Are you just saying don't give this man boots? What is he going to do without boots? What are Africans going to do without aid? I think those are persuasive arguments. And so I think with the blog, what it provides for us is a way to kind of talk through these issues. And like Albert, I don't have answers for how to go forward or what the right way is to do these things. But I think that by opening this up to collaboration with some great scholars from the continent and hearing what people want and their ideas and alternative ways to move forward, I think is really important. So what I would like to see in the future of the blog is currently we do a lot of critiquing, which I love. I love that kind of thing. But I also would like us to really kind of start talking about, okay, if invisible children and CONY 2012, if that is not the way to deal with that kind of issue, what's another way? Do we as scholars in the global north, should we be doing anything, to deal with the LRA? Should we be looking within our own communities? What are alternative ways to move forward? And so I'm hoping that with the blog we can talk and have more collaborations and go forward that way. So thank you.
I thought what you really wanted was to get us to 100 million hits, like every week or something like that. And so that's what you're all about. You all have to keep tweeting and everything like that. So thank you very much. Our final speaker on this particular panel is the Reverend Ranjit Matthews of the Episcopal Church in the U.S. He's Associate Rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Long Beach. He was brought up outside of Boston. And he graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York, home of Reinhold Niebuhr and hotbeds of contextual African-American, African, and Third World theologies, among many other things. He was ordained to the priesthood in 2007. He has served in many different capacities. In addition to Brazil, India, Belize, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, he's also served in South Africa, Tanzania, and Massachusetts, and now Long Beach. Ranjit is one of the deepest thinkers I know on issues of mission, issues of theology, issues of religious syncretism, issues of charity. And so I'm very pleased to have him on our panel today.
Thank you, Cecilia, for that nice introduction, and thank you to you and to Tanya just for this opportunity to be on there's such an esteemed panel. It's just really wonderful, and as a priest, I don't get this opportunity to sort of be involved with scholars and just the like, and to just be at the symposium, so it's a great gift. I'd like to speak a little bit about the church. And as an ordained member of it, I think I have a little bit to say about it and what it says or what it means to say with respect to charity and or humanitarianism in the world, particularly in Africa. It's funny, in liturgy, and for those of you who might be in liturgical churches or liturgical places of worship, liturgy means in the Greek the work of the people. And so within churches or mosques or other places, that's certainly what I would think religious people do. They create the worship. And one of the things that happens, particularly after the sermon or a homily, is the people rise up in a church and they say together in liturgical churches, they say the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is basically when you say like, well, okay, thank you, Ranjit, for preaching, but this is really what I believe. And they go on to say, this is what I believe about God, about Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So it's a way of sort of, realigning, what we really think as a community, as opposed to maybe some deviancies that I may have shared in my sermon. So that goes with respect to the Nicene Creed. It's a way of sort of the people standing up and rejecting, or not rejecting all, but rejecting some of what I might have said. I say that with respect to, in 1910, there was this conference called the Edinburgh Conference, and it gathered together, a wide array of ecumenical participants. But I think one of the things that came out of it, and not in a single voice, but something that was heard above others, was that, we need to bring God to Africa. We need to bring God to Africa. That was the notion, as if God or the divine wasn't already there. So that happened in 1910. Now, in 2010, there was another gathering of the Edinburgh Conference, and all participants from a variety of different churches, and it was a much more muddled message of what we can do out in the world. And I think that stands as sort of the Nicene Creed, kind of standing up and saying, well, at this point, this is what we believe. We're not sure exactly what we believe, but we're moving on beyond 1910. And to me, speaks a little bit about what we see and think of as missionaries. I went, as Cecilia said, I went to South Africa as a missionary, and my wife and I went to Tanzania as theologians and as an architect, as missionaries. But the way in which these words are used now within the Episcopal churches, now we're looking at it, as opposed to being missionaries, we're seeing it as mission partners. So it's a new way, a new framework of looking at it. That doesn't mean that we're all of one voice with respect to being a missionary. But it's something to think about. It's something that we're really struggling with. Our missionary conferences, this is something that we're looking at, not only mission outside the United States, but also within it. What is this issue of being global and also local? How is that sort of conversation happening between the two? And I bring this up, vis-a-vis Africa, because, I think, as some of you might know, and as many of our panelists have said, religious trips or religious-minded aid towards Africa is a great sum. And over the past 50 years, there's been over, I think, $1 trillion worth of money that has gone to Africa, in particular. And and if we look at it as Americans, as I am, 90% of American adults are involved in the charity industry. 90% of adults. And so then one would say then, as Robert Lupton says in his book, Toxic Charity, he says, the compassion industry is universally accepted as a virtuous and constructive enterprise. But then he also says that religiously motivated charity is often the most irresponsible. Now, I would want to counter and look at, this understanding that we look at aid as both religious and or secular. I have troubles with that because it points us towards an understanding of duality, that one is considered wholly connected to religion and the other is not that. And so I think that's problematic because then we tend to deify the religion, right? We tend to deify, compassion. Compassion meaning, passionate. And as we know in the New Testament, Jesus is moving in sort of sending you out to go and serve in the world. Whereas in the Old Testament, God is seen as sort of drawing Israel towards him. So that's more in the Old Testament, this kind of drawing in. And in the New Testament, you see Jesus sending out. And so this was where we come up with the understanding of missionary. Now, my problem with that is that, it's so easy to have compassion. I was, certainly moved when I see people, particularly in India, who are struck with HIV and AIDS and or other things. And I'm so moved and I have compassion. And so then when it's molded to and with a religious understanding, how can then we critique it? If religion is of and connected to the divine and to God, it's so much harder to critique it, isn't it? It's so much harder. Oh my gosh, you're critiquing God, or you're critiquing somebody who has this intentionality of doing good. And yet we know that, good intentions pave the way to, not so great things. And so that's particularly my critique, is that, within the Episcopal Church or within other churches, we need to start looking beyond an understanding of just we're always going, and we're going to give to these good people all over the world, but we're not receiving anything back. Now, I want you to know that, over the past couple of years, and maybe every year, around $2.5 billion to $5 billion is spent by churches going on these mission trips across the world. $2.5 to $5 billion every year is spent, and might I add, these mission trips could be, Could be 7 days, could be 8 days, could be 9 days. And you know, there's an understanding that sometimes we're just going to go and offer and build certain things in particular countries, and then we'll go back and we'll pat ourselves on the back. Now, that's only one part of it. Let's be fair. There's also the other side of, you know, of these folks, and I include myself in that, doing a lot of good things. But we really need to start critiquing where we're coming from with the church. Why is it that we only look at secular aid and critique that, but we can't critique church aid? You know, church aid is just deified once again. And I think we move into sort of really problematic areas when we don't start critiquing our own selves. You know, it's something that, as I was reading the Zambian economist, Dambisa Moyo, who really sort of gave me really impetus about, you know, what we're doing. And how can we really move forward if we're just giving without any sense of, you know, of receiving from other folks, from the people that we are sending our money to? Now, I think it's what there's a scholar in Tanzania by the name of Dr. Issa Shivaji. And he wrote particularly on the NGOization of Africa, Dr. Issa Shivaji. And as I look at it, and I look at the church is the largest NGO in the world. Tell me not, right? It's in every single community. It's in every single community. Now, if we don't look at what the church is doing, the churches vis-a-vis other dioceses across the world in connection with, like, for example, the Diocese of Cape Town with the Episcopal Diocese of New York. If we don't look at that and just say, well, we'll just let these folks, let these good-intentioned folks in these different dioceses or this particular diocese within the global north work its way, we're not doing our job as religious folks. I don't know how many of you out there are religious folks, are, you know, paint yourself as a Christian and somebody who's involved in a parish. But if we don't look at that and critique our own ways of doing things, particularly with aid, then I think we're in trouble. We're in a tad bit of trouble, and I really commend churches like the Lutheran Church and the Methodist Church that are really doing this hard work, because I think it's important. Thank you.